Welcome everyone to this MNI Connect video conference, which is being live streamed to a wider audience. I'm Kevin Woodfield, responsible for our MNI Connect events program, and it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Ollie Rehn, Governor of the Bank of Finland and Governing Council member of the European Central Bank. He joins us to discuss developments in the Eurozone economy and ECB monetary policy. And I start by congratulating the Governor, who last week was reappointed for a further 7-year term. And as the Governor's speech earlier this month highlighted, we can already anticipate that it will be a second term that will be marked by momentous geopolitical changes as the United States under Donald Trump presents huge trade and defence challenges to Europe. I further note the findings of a study published by the Bank of Finland last week, showing a hit to global GDP of 0.5% a year, assuming currently announced US tariffs and retaliations all proceed, with a bigger impact of 1% or more in the euro area and double that for China. Presented with such a contraction, the inflation impact is described as moderate. How will the ECB respond to such an outlook, and what are the contingencies? Dr. Ollie Rehn, an Oxford DPhil, has held top European and international posts for many years. Before assuming his current role in 2018, he was at different times a Finnish MP and served as Minister of Economic Affairs in 2015 and 16. He was among the first group of MEPs when Finland joined the EU in the mid-90s and was later Vice President of the European Parliament. From 2010 to 14, he was Vice President of the European Commission when he was responsible for economic and monetary union in the difficult aftermath of the financial crash and Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. So he is no stranger to tough times. And we thank the Governor very much for being with us today. This live streamed MNI Connect video conference will run for up to an hour and a quarter. Governor Rehn will make some opening remarks for about 15 minutes, for which he has kindly brought along some slides, after which we will open it up to questions from our MNI Connect guests. As mentioned, we're live streaming this event to a wider audience who are listening in. I welcome you all, and everything here is discussed here is public and on the record. Thank you everybody for your attention. Thank you very much again, Governor, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for your very kind words of introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let me first thank MNI for inviting me to give a talk at this conference. To kick off, I'll briefly discuss the economic outlook in the Eurozone and the current lines of thought concerning the ECB's monetary policy. And I will focus particularly on how the significant shifts in world politics of recent weeks will, in my view, affect the euro area economy and the ECB's monetary policy. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you, and that's fine. Yes, thanks, Nick. So, as we all know, geopolitics currently dominates and weighs on the outlook for the global economy, and does so with exceptional force. Russia's illegal, brutal war of aggression in Ukraine has been going on for more than 3 years already. It has shaken the European security order, and more recent events, especially in and after the Munich Security Conference a month ago, have marked a major disruption in the world order in a way that is, in my view, dangerous for Europe. And this has forced the European Union to seek to strengthen its common defenses. It is clear that the United States is undergoing a fundamental change of direction, both in its foreign and security policy and in its domestic political development. This is not necessarily just a temporary phenomenon, but it may be a more permanent turn in US politics and society. And US foreign policy is now operating under a very different kind of rationality than it used to do, which may be the understatement of the week. America First trade policy is profoundly protectionist, but at the same time highly unpredictable. In any case, there are no winners in a trade war. Tariffs and the related uncertainty will hit investment and slow down growth virtually everywhere. The latest indicators on the US economy point to weaker than expected growth, which would also affect growth prospects in Europe. As said, as a result of the turmoil in world politics in recent weeks, Europe has woken up to the necessity of strengthening our common defense. The situation is quite acute, and many EU countries, led by Germany, have announced significant decisions to increase defense spending. Europe is now taking action and responding to the challenge of forming and financing a common strong defense. And as you certainly know, we are expecting decisions today from the German Bundestag. These defense investments will have to be made in a situation where the public deficits of EU member states are already large. However, the investments required for defense are of such magnitude that they cannot be financed simply by increased taxation or cutting other public sector expenditure. Therefore, in my view, it is justified in the short term to utilize the flexibility elements that are included in the new fiscal rules of the European Union, provided that longer-term debt sustainability is not compromised. And this is also the reason why we need common European financing decisions, financing solutions implemented in a way that truly strengthens our common security and accelerates joint procurement and production. I'm thinking, for instance, of air defense and drone production. There has to be a European plan for production and for procurement so that we avoid duplication and production bottlenecks. Could I have the next slide, please? Recent statements from the US about imposing import tariffs have raised the threat of a trade war in the global economy. And as Kevin already referred to, an analysis published a week ago by the Bank of Finland illustrates the significant risks that a trade war poses to economic growth. I don't go into all details of this study, but just point some important elements, which is that the study assumes that the US would impose a 25% tariff increase on all imports from the euro area and a 20% increase on all imports from China. It also assumes that both the euro area and China would impose equivalent tariffs on the US. Moreover, our calculations take into account the potential economic effects of increased uncertainty affecting economic policy. And this scenario truly demonstrates that there are no winners in a trade war. As a result, world GDP would decline by more than 0.5% per year, and the effects on the euro area and China would be even greater. In our view, a key aspect of a trade war is the rise in uncertainty, which we are already witnessing and which could lead to a reduced willingness to investment among businesses. There are different estimates of this. For instance, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy has done an interesting and relevant study which shows somewhat less significant impact. I think we put more weight on uncertainty, which at least in the short term is the most detrimental effect of trade wars. And concerning trade policy, efforts should in any case be made to prevent a trade war through a fair negotiated solution to mitigate the negative effects on growth. To support a negotiated solution, Europe should be and is prepared to respond to the imposition of tariffs with proportionate countermeasures. Can I have the next slide, please? US tariffs and increased uncertainty are already having adverse effects on economic growth outlook in the euro area in the immediate and near term. Europe's response to the deterioration of the security situation will have its own effects on European economies, but these are very difficult to quantify at this stage. In any case, the growth outlook for the euro area remains subdued. According to the ECB's recent March forecast, growth in the euro area is gradually picking up, but at a slower pace than expected, and growth risks are tilted to the downside. In addition to cyclical factors, the euro area economy is also experiencing structural problems. Productivity growth is slower than before, and the weakness appears to be more structural than previously expected. But it would be wrong to say that it is entirely structural. One, if not the only reason for Europe's slow productivity growth is precisely the weak development of investment in recent years. Let me reveal that I do not belong to those who makes a crystal clear distinction between structural and cyclical factors. That would be against my macroeconomic training. Rather, I see the distinction as a line drawn in water. And here I feel like applying a certain giant of economics, paraphrasing him, in the long run, we are all retired, but in the meantime, we need more productive investment. In other words, although the euro area's longer-term challenges concerning growth and competitiveness cannot be solved by monetary policy, the fall in interest rates has brought and is bringing welcome room for maneuver for households and companies. Rate cuts have been supportive of the investments that are required to improve productivity. Of course, in the longer term, the level and growth of investments is determined by their expected real returns. Although there is little to be positive about the security situation in Europe, the expected increases in defense spending and investment are at least likely to support GDP growth over the medium term. Could I have my next slide, please? Inflation in the euro area is stabilizing at the ECB's 2% symmetric inflation target over the medium term. Disinflation is on track, and the path of disinflation has been pretty much in line with forecasts. Wage inflation has by and large decelerated, and forward-looking wage indicators like the euro area wage tracker point to a clear slowdown in wage growth. Likewise, most measures of underlying inflation, which excludes energy and food prices, also point to a sustained convergence of inflation around the 2% inflation target. Risks to the inflation outlook are, in our view, two-sided. Protectionism in world trade dampens growth and increases uncertainty about the inflation outlook. Geopolitical tensions pose a wide range of risks to the energy market, consumer confidence, and corporate investment. Could I have my penultimate slide before I move to conclusion? The ECB's latest decision 12 days ago to ease monetary policy leaned on the fact that basically two elements. Inflation is stabilizing and growth is weakening. Thus, the Governing Council decided to cut the key policy rates by 25 basis points. The rate cut was the sixth since we started easing monetary policy. Since last June, the deposit facility rate, the key policy rate, has been lowered by a total of 1.5 percentage points, i.e. from 4% to 2.5%. Monetary policy is thus becoming meaningfully less restrictive. The decision was based, as usual, on three elements which you might call our reaction function if you feel like. First, the inflation outlook. Second, the dynamics of underlying inflation. And third, the strength of monetary policy transmission. Let me also point out that we are not pre-committed to any interest rate path. Policy rates are set at each meeting based on the latest information and our comprehensive assessment next time on the 17th of April, just before Easter. The Governing Council wants to retain full freedom of action, especially in our current times of pervasive uncertainty. Could I have my last slide, please? Let me now conclude. The world is now undergoing a transition of potentially similar magnitude as 3 decades ago, when the Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War ended, and Europe united. At that time, the evolution of humankind took a step forward, and security rooted in cooperation was substantially strengthened, which is important to all European states. Today, the world is in reverse gear. Power politics has returned in a brutal way with Russia's invasion. The United States is standing by Russia and playing sphere of influence politics, and China is challenging the entire international order. Nevertheless, we must be able to navigate even this geopolitically very difficult terrain. With the Munich Security Conference, Europe has received yet another wake-up call. At the same time, in parallel, we must focus on our own economic problems. Europe needs investments in productivity growth, in human capital, and in research and innovation. And protectionism highlights the need to complete the single market and expand the EU's already broad network of free trade agreements. The stabilization of inflation and the weakening of growth outlook have supported monetary policy easing since last summer. The ECB's monetary policy has been reasonably successful in bringing inflation down without inflicting unnecessary pain to the real economy and to the society at large. The past few weeks have shown that Europe must urgently get its act together and stand united in the face of external security threats. In the coming weeks and months, Europe will have to demonstrate that it is taking action and meeting the challenge of strengthening its defense. There is simply no time to waste. Thank you very much. I end here, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Governor, thank you very much indeed for that very helpful, if I think rather disquieting presentation. I'm going to move straight away to the Q&A part of our session and invite panelists to come in with questions by raising a virtual hand, by clicking the reactions button on your toolbar, and I will bring you in order. And Governor, if I could ask you to address each questioner in turn. And I see we've a number of hands up already, and I start with Jan Vlieger. Hi, Jan.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you. And thank you, Governor Rehn, for those very clear remarks. I wanted to talk about some of the forces that you're going to learn about in the next few weeks. And I completely understand we're in an environment of very elevated uncertainty. There is no need indeed for you to commit to any monetary policy decision while you're waiting for that news. But I'm just curious as to which way the arguments go. So you yourself talked about inflation stabilizing around the target, growth is weakening. The next big thing we're going to find out about is whether the tariffs are actually put in place or not, and how high they are. And then on the other side, there is potentially some positive fiscal news, but that's quite far away in time, and certainly beyond Germany is still highly uncertain. So what kind of things do you think you might learn between now and the April meeting to do anything other than cut again? That's what I'm struggling to understand.
Thank you very much, Gerrit Jan, for this very important question. And if I try and open my reasoning in this regard, so in my view, there are two main factors which have already been moving. In fact, since our latest monetary policy meeting 12 days ago. The first one is the geopolitical situation, especially as regards the negotiations on a ceasefire peace agreement between the United States, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. And the second factor is the trade policy dimension, where we have seen some further protectionist measures decided or imposed by the US and Europe deciding countermeasures to that. So from here on until April and beyond, I will be in particular focusing on these two dimensions. And the interesting thing to my mind and the relevant thing for monetary policy is to try and make some sense concerning the timeline of different effects. To my mind, it seems that as regards trade policy, the effect is fairly immediate, especially due to pervasive uncertainty. We may see, we may assume a quite strong effect going towards next year. So trade policy or increased tariffs will weigh on growth this year cumulatively towards next year before the economy may adjust. This was the path roughly in 2018 and 19 when Trump first time raised tariffs. And the impact on growth will be negative. That will also to some extent dampen inflation. The impact on inflation cannot be ex ante defined. The second factor, defense spending. There, if I had an optimistic view of Europe, I would say that it will have a rapid impact on growth thanks to rapid decision making and implementation of decisions to invest in defense, both at the European level and in the member state level, like Germany. But the experience tells that there are often delays in execution, and thus I would expect that that the effect of increased spending in defense, investment in defense will be rather over the medium term. It is likely to have some, not huge, but some impact upwards concerning inflation. So we have effects going different directions. In the short term, I'd expect some dampening effect on growth in Europe. In the medium term, the defense spending may change the risk balance to a different direction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you like to follow up on any of that?
No, that's very clear. That's really helpful. Thank you, Governor Rehn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Andreas Billmar. Hi, Andreas. Can you come in?
Good morning, all. Thank you very much, Governor, for your introductory remarks. I had two questions, if I may. The first one, I was sort of interested in the line, literally, and the point that you made about the distinction between cyclical and structural factors being a line in the water. Now, they obviously have very different implications for monetary policy, and that's probably a variation of the question that Jan just asked. But maybe you can sort of unpack that a little bit. And then there is a second question, so it's a bit of a tricky one. I wanted you to be a little bit engaged in a little bit in a retrospective of your own views. And the question is, how has your assessment of the monetary policy challenge changed over the last year, say, since the beginning of the cutting cycle, very roughly?
Thank you, Andreas, very much for this very pertinent questions concerning the distinction between cyclical and structural as regards investment. I think if I try to say simplify and explain how my reasoning goes in this regard, I think it's clear that over the longer term, the real rate of return is the critical thing, and that's the basis for investment decisions in the private sector, especially in enterprises, in businesses. But at the same time, if you look at the experience of the Eurozone, for instance, during the financial crisis and Eurozone crisis and its aftermath, we could see that we had rather tight financing conditions in those years before the ECB started its zero or negative interest rate policy and its QE. I'm referring to the decisions in 2014 and 2015. I recall I was minister at the time in Finland in around 2015, 2016, 17, and we had a spurt in growth then thanks to mainly two factors. One was that we restored our own cost competitiveness thanks to the then agreed competitiveness pact, which reduced unit labor costs quite significantly, and which has stayed as it was for the past 10 years. And then in parallel, we could feel the positive impact of the ECB's more proactive monetary policy. And the combination of this supported growth, my regret is that that was a very quite short-lived period of growth. And I recall that in the Eurozone, from 2013 onwards until the COVID pandemic, altogether 12 million jobs net were created. So I think that experience shows that we have different factors at play. And yes, we have to invest in research and innovation. We have to conduct structural reforms in the member states, but we also need, say, meaningful financing conditions to support investment in the member states, in companies and enterprises. Concerning your second question as regards the retrospective reflection, I wish I were able to do that. That's always a challenge. But I think there's one factor which I hope you don't misunderstand, which is that I have always the European standpoint when I take decisions in the ECB Governing Council. At the same time, the country I know best, i.e. the Republic of Finland, we have one specialty in terms of lending conditions, which is common to many other countries, but not the prevalent mode, which is that we have the normal practice is that our mortgages are linked to variable interest rates. Normally it is 12-month Euribor. So we feel the tightening of monetary policy very quickly. Transmission works effectively. I wish everybody could have variable rates in Europe. And we had a slump in the housing market, and we had a downturn in construction. Now we are seeing relief from that, and we are feeling the supportive element of easing of monetary policy. So I'm explaining this because we could a year ago in this country see the effect of tightening of monetary policy probably more concretely than many others could see it at the time. So therefore, last summer, I was fairly confident that disinflation is on track. and our growth outlook is relatively subdued. So in my case, it was not difficult to support the rate cuts in June and onwards.
Thank you, Governor. Andreas, do you want to come back quickly on any of
Very
that?
quickly, what's the stadium in the background of your screen?
Thank you, Andreas. That's the main football stadium of Helsinki. It's not the Olympic Stadium, but main football stadium, and the venue of FC Helsinki, HJK, where, for instance, Jari Litmanen played for a few seasons. That's also my home ground. I've played there for 40 odd years in different formations. And as you asked, you are talking to a Finnish champion of boys over 60 football. We had a tournament last summer, and we had 6 games over the weekend, plus the 30 centigrade. So if the first game was a little bit slower than in the Champions League, you can imagine what was the last game like in this regard. Walking soccer, walking football.
Thank you, and thank you, Andreas. I do wish, as we move along, I wish Finland well as the World Cup qualifiers start. And note, for once, Governor, you are not drawn in England's group. But I'll move along to Julian Callow. Julian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Governor, and congratulations on your recent footballing success. That is quite an achievement. So let me ask you a couple of questions. And first of all, thank you for your presentation here. This is very interesting, particularly your slide looking at the consequences of a global trade war. The consequences that you set out there for the euro area are considerably greater than I think other studies, including those from other investment banks, have been showing. And so I'm wondering if you would agree with the comment that the Vice President of the ECB made in an interview with the Sunday Times published over the weekend, which was that a trade war would have a much worse impact on growth than on inflation. I wonder if you would agree with that. And secondly, you referred to the new expression of ECB communication, meaningfully less restrictive. And of course, that's true. If you cut interest rates significantly, you are less restrictive. I suppose the point I'd like to ask you about is, how exactly do you feel about the current interest rate here? Would in your view, for the Eurozone economy, this still be of a restrictive character or not, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julian, for your question. And I'm, as you asked first, as regards the statement of my friend Luis de Guindos, who is an ardent Atletico Madrid supporter. Good for him. Whether I agree with him or not, I would very much agree with him, and I think we both have studied carefully the ECB's latest economic analysis, and we have also done our own at the Bank of Finland, and both of these demonstrate, to my mind, that the negative impact on growth from a trade war is or would be larger than the impact on inflation. I'm here talking about the euro area. In the US, the impact on inflation is likely to be more significant. It's the final consumer who in the end of the day will pay for tariffs. But as regards other jurisdictions, including the Eurozone, the predominant impact, to my mind, is the negative impact on growth. And that is also, to some extent, dampening inflation in the euro area. There are other countervailing forces, but the overall net impact on inflation is difficult to judge ex ante. It is an empirical question and depends on many factors. You also referred to the study of the Bank of Finland and compare it to some other studies by commercial banks or investment banks. You're right that our study gives a fairly high figure. This is a typical macroeconomic study in a sense that we assume tariffs across the board. Now, what has happened so far is the US tariffs on steel and aluminum products from Europe, which represent, we just calculated it a few days ago, and it represents around 5 to 6% of total exports of goods from the EU to the US. So the coverage is substantially smaller, although it is a significant industrial sector. So we are not, in that case, we are not talking about that kind of magnitude than in our macro study of the overall economy. And then you asked also about, or you referred to our description of monetary policy as meaningfully less restrictive. I think maybe here it's useful to say that the financing conditions, meanwhile, are still. I mean, we have seen some easing of financial conditions. If you look at, for instance, the growth and level of loans, both to businesses and households, but we are starting from a relatively low level, and the delta, the change is also relatively small. So I would still qualify financing conditions as tight, even though we have probably bottomed out and we are seeing some easing in financial conditions. And maybe one final point on this concerning monetary policy. So I think going forward, as things look now, even since our early March meeting, are indicating that some of the downside risks will likely materialize that we defined in March. I'm referring especially to the Trump tariffs on EU steel and aluminium and the continued protectionist tendency in the US. These have increased uncertainty and are having negative effects on growth in the euro area already in the short term. Meanwhile, the expected increase in defense spending in Europe will to some extent increase GDP, but the strongest effect will likely be felt over the medium term, depending on the decision making and implementation, as I responded previously. So, on the other hand, the inflation outlook is more balanced, or the risks to the inflation outlook are more balanced. Defense and infrastructure spending may increase price pressures, but in the medium term, trade uncertainty weighs on inflation downwards in the euro area predominantly. So my conclusion, my very tentative conclusion at this stage is that in making monetary policy, well, actually that's not my conclusion, that's how I see it. In making monetary policy, our mandate is indeed price stability, defined as 2% symmetric inflation target over the medium term. And my tentative conclusion on the basis of recent data and prospects forward is that if the data, including our forecasts and other analysis, indicate that to reach that goal of 2% inflation, the right reaction in monetary policy should be to cut, then in my view we should indeed do so. But if data indicates something else, then we would not cut in April and we would pause. Simply, that's the art of monetary policy in these strange times of phenomenal uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you. Julian, do you want to come back in briefly?
That's fine. Thank you very much, Governor.
Thank you. Thank you, Julian. Filippo Cartiglia. Hi, Filippo.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you. And thank you, Governor, for the very interesting presentation. I have two questions. One on you painted a somber picture of GDP activity in the Eurozone. Though I think there is one aspect that has been probably better than anybody expected, and it is employment growth. The labor market in the Eurozone has been very strong, and actually probably if we would say it's behaving above the trend growth that was prevailing before the pandemic. Now, my question is, everybody knows that probably stronger activity in general pushes inflation up and tends to push inflation up. But how do you think about the difference between GDP and employment on inflation? So the impact on inflation, in your view, is bigger from the GDP side or from the employment side? And what does monetary policy do? Does it impact more GDP or does it impact more employment, in your view? Okay, so this is a question on kind of more on monetary policy. But I also have another question on tariffs. It's not strictly monetary policy, but you are a very experienced policymaker. So if I may, I will ask you, you mentioned tariffs from the US, and tariffs have already been imposed, and we have seen two very different reactions to these tariffs. China had almost a 20% tariff imposed on them, and they've virtually so far not retaliated. The retaliation has been small, only on a small part of it. Instead, Canada has been very aggressive in fighting back and putting tariffs back. If you were to give a suggestion to the European policymakers that have to decide on what to do, how to react to tariffs on EU products, would you think it's better to retaliate one for one, or it's better to take it and wait and see, as the Chinese are doing?
Thank you, Filippo, for these two very key questions. First, as regards employment and GDP, I think you are fully right that one of the bright spots of the European economy has been the high level of employment rate and the low unemployment. Unemployment is, despite quite subdued growth in recent times, unemployment is still at its historical low, which is 6.2% on average in Europe. And I have to say that if I should choose which is a worse situation, that you would be concerned about unemployment or low productivity, I would, in the short term, prefer being concerned about low productivity than unemployment. So, in that sense, we don't have the worst of all possible situations for the moment. And what has impacted on employment growth? Several factors, demographics certainly. Net immigration has been also important in terms of maintaining a labor market together with some structural reforms that is somewhat more flexible than it was, say, 10, not to speak of 20 years ago. And as you asked concerning GDP and employment in relation to monetary policy, I would say that one way of looking at this is through the Phillips curve, grand old Phillips curve, which in my view and based on our empirical analysis at the Bank of Finland also has become rather non-linear in the euro area. In other words, for a long time during the previous decade, 2010s, we had an almost flat Phillips curve. Unemployment went from somewhere around 13% to say 7-8% without us experiencing any increase in inflation. And some people were up until July 21 concerned about Japanification in Europe. Now we are seeing that at some point there is a change, but this point came later in Europe, or has come later in Europe than say the previous assumptions of NAIRU, or the natural rate of unemployment, would have indicated. In the US, the situation is somewhat different. There, probably due to or thanks to stronger fiscal stimulus and already tighter labor market, there has been more shortages of labor than in Europe, and we've seen more sticky wage inflation in the US than in Europe. So I would say that this non-linear nature of the Phillips curve is a very important factor which we have to keep in mind when making monetary policy. And I'm looking forward to further studies in this regard, further analysis in this regard, as we are now engaged in our strategy review, which we will complete in the course of this year. I think this is one of the key issues we have to study in that context. And I believe that both the Sintra conference of the ECB and the Jackson Hole of the Fed are devoted largely also to the labor market developments. Second, concerning tariffs, I try to respond briefly. So you all know, most of you are economists by training, and you know the concepts first best and second best. So the economists often clinically provide advice that the first best is not to retaliate if you are facing tariffs for economic reasons. But we are not in the world where economics or the economic thinking only dominates. We are in a very second best world where political and policy considerations are important, and at least to my mind, we as Europe, as the European Union, we cannot lie down in fire as Trump and his administration is putting quite some less friendly fire on Europe through tariffs and through security policy positions. And we have to have self-confidence, and we can do it in a proportionate manner. And in my view, it is the correct response that we are deciding on as the European Union. We are deciding on proportionate countermeasures to the tariffs that the US has imposed on Europe.
Very clear. Thank you. Any brief comeback on that, Filippo?
No, thank you. I had one more question on the stadium on the background, but Andreas has already asked, so
Indeed,
all good for me. Thank you.
Indeed, he has. Okay, thank you. Marco Stringer, please. Hello, Marco. Marco, are you with us? Okay, I will come back to Marco. I'll move to Chris Crow. Hi, Chris.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry, I had problem to undo my. Sorry,
okay.
Chris. I have a problem with the video. Okay.
We've got you now, Marco. Why don't you come in? Then I'll move to Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Apologies, Chris, to interrupt you, and thank you very much, Governor, for the presentation. I had a question similar to the very first one from Jan. Let me try to put in a bit different packaging it a bit differently, which is similar to the debate at the ECB Watchers last week. So as you mentioned, under uncertainty, economy is more depressed, investment is lower. What do you think is the best optimal response in the short term? And there were two discussions. And the first one is the model-wise response would say that a central bank needs to be agile and respond to offset uncertainty in the short term, and then later on go back up with a policy rate. Or option two, some arguing about two elements that would suggest a pause in April. The first one is that, as also you hint before, trade tensions are downside for GDP, but the impact is unclear on inflation. And another argument from some of your colleagues is that this huge uncertainty is much easier to deal with that in the June forecast round. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I have always been of the view, and I am ever more strongly of the view that at each meeting we can and we must take decisions on rates and monetary policy. In other words, in my view, we should not limit ourselves by stating publicly or privately that we only can take decisions when we have fresh forecasts on the table. That would limit us to March, June, September, and December. And we could as well cancel the rest of the meetings if we had that position. We always have new elements on table. We always have new data on the table, and we have the possibility of assessing to which direction the economy, both GDP and inflation, are likely to develop compared to our previous forecast. So that's my starting point in this regard. And to my mind, the critical thing is that we have to assess how these recent changes and forthcoming changes before April and our projection from there onwards, how this will affect our primary objective, which is 2% inflation over the medium term. And in my view, there is also a case that one can make. It may not be the central scenario for the moment, but there is also the case one can make that in case the trade tensions will be amplified and we see a significant impact on GDP growth downwards, while the impact on inflation is uncertain, then I think there is in the medium term the risk of undershooting our target, and this alternative scenario also needs to be borne in mind, even though it is not the central scenario for the moment. So our consideration is price stability, defined as symmetric 2% over the medium term, and we have to continue to analyze what impact these recent and projected developments have on the economy in light of that object. I say also one more thing, which is that often people think that when you say you are practicing data dependency, that would be backward looking. I don't see it at all like that. In my view, data dependency is forward looking, not least because our price stability target is defined over the medium term. So by definition, it has to be forward looking, and we have to consider all data and all indicators and do a comprehensive assessment on that basis. Of course, that requires also significant degree of judgment, but to my mind, monetary policy is not only science; it is also art. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Any quick comeback?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now to Chris Crow. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Kevin, and thank you, Governor, for these really interesting remarks and for enlightening us about your sporting prowess, which is very impressive. I wanted to raise a question of, as policy, is getting meaningfully less restrictive, is moving towards where a kind of range of estimates of a kind of neutral rate might be. Do you have any sympathy for the view that, as we get closer to that neutral kind of range, that the ECB can afford to cut rates a bit more slowly?
Thank you, Chris. And you are right that we agreed to define monetary policy in the last meeting as meaningfully less restrictive, even though, as I said before, financial conditions are still, compared to long-term average, relatively tight, even if we are seeing some easing in positive easing in financing conditions. Now, you raised an interesting question, which is neutral rate, and then consequently that leads to the question, where is the natural rate, R star for the moment, the natural rate of interest or the equilibrium interest rate? And I can say that for me, this is an indispensable concept as an analytical framework for thinking about monetary policy. And I love to discuss R star with John Williams or fellow central bankers or economists in the pub. But I have to say that the natural rate is, as it is not an observable indicator, but it is derived from several indicators, and there is plenty of uncertainty in it. So it is not a viable, concrete policy-making tool in making monetary policy. So it's a good analytical framework to think about monetary policy, but not a concrete policy tool. So by implication, defining the neutral rate is challenging, and I usually try to avoid that and try to rather stick to our reaction function, which is that we look at three issues, three factors in particular. We look at first inflation outlook. Second, we look at the underlying inflation neutralized from energy and food prices, and third, we look at the strength of monetary policy transmission. This is a more pragmatic and measurable way of, not miserable, but measurable way of making monetary policy.
Chris, want to come back in?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I would just follow up and say, well, you know, in light of those three, elements of how you look at the policy, is there a case for slowing the pace of rate cuts?
Thank you. You can imagine different scenarios, and I've defined, say, my baseline scenario already, which is in simple terms that growth outlook in the euro area remains subdued, and since March we are seeing some downside risks to growth materializing. Meanwhile, risks to the inflation outlook are two-sided, broadly balanced, and this forms the context and the operating environment where we are likely taking decisions in April, and we will have to see now what kind of developments and what kind of data we get by the April meeting, and then we judge.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I'm going to move to Zerb Sachi. Zerb, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Governor, for the extremely interesting presentation and comments. I had a question on something you mentioned briefly in your presentation on the fiscal front. I mean, Germany have clearly announced a large package, and I guess some would say that they are the country that can do it because they have significant fiscal headroom, and other countries are in a very different situation. So hard to imagine a country like Italy or France coming up with a similar package in terms of percentage of GDP. You had mentioned that we should, or Europe should, attempt to utilize the flexibility in the new fiscal kind of rules, and that we should look at common European financial kind of decisions or tools. Is there a concern? Are you concerned potentially about the impact that a European-wide fiscal package or program might have on individual kind of debt and deficit situations in different countries, notwithstanding the fact that some of that funding may well end up being at a common European level, such as, for example, the EU?
Thank you, Zoeb, for this very challenging question, but also very important question. And I think I would say that we need to make use of several building blocks in achieving the overall objective that was defined by the European Council. And I believe that I used to teach European studies at the University of Helsinki and to give lectures elsewhere. And I used to say that if the European Council, if you want to know where the European Union is heading, look at the conclusions of the European Council from its summit meetings. And I think that's still valid, even though I have to say that in more recent period, last 10, 20 years, the Commission work program, together with the Parliament's imprint, have become more and more defining the policy orientation of the European Union. Having said that, I still think the latest decision of the European Council is a serious one and taken very seriously to be implemented, executed and implemented. And to achieve that, one needs to make use of several building blocks, which I just list here. So the first one and the basis is the national budgets, i.e. increasing defense spending through the national budgets. And for that, yes, you need to use the flexibility clause of the new fiscal rules. And I think it makes full sense under the current security conditions when we are talking about an existential crisis from the European standpoint. Second, there is the European European financing solution defined by the European Council of 150 billion euros, leaning on joint guarantees. And third, we may see something else. I'm not deep into that loop because we work in a separate dimension as central bankers. But I recall that when we created the European Stability Mechanism 15 years ago, then there were different options on the table, and now in a rather similar manner, there has been discussion among some member states about a European Defence Fund, which would be intergovernmental, which might include also countries like United Kingdom and Norway. So yes, this will have an impact on debt and deficit in Europe, and that's why it's important that the member states aim at doing it so that they can maintain the medium to long-term debt sustainability. And that's why we need significant European financial solutions supporting the member states in achieving their goals of increasing the share of defense spending over GDP.
Thank you. Thank you, Zerb. I'm going to squeeze in the couple of minutes we've got left. Mark de Muizel. Mark.
Oh, hi. Good morning, Governor. Thank you for the presentation and the answer to all the questions. I wanted to come back maybe to a question that was asked about 5-10 minutes ago on the employment and GDP shocks. And I think, as you mentioned, in the last few weeks, it's become clear we've had a tightening of financial conditions. If you look at rates, the exchange rate and all that, which is probably a sort of short-term negative growth shock. And we're more likely to be hit in 2 weeks' time by a sort of trade shock, tariff shock, which would be another short-term negative GDP shock, as your presentation, and very useful, actually, slide. Thank you for that, showed. And we've discussed at length, I think, the impact on inflation. And what I find, I'll be curious to hear your thought about the impact on the labor market, actually, more than just inflation per se. And if it's something that, how do you think maybe with your colleagues in the governing council, the sort of natural instinct would be to address that risk here? Would that come via the sort of wage channel, as we've seen in the last 3-4 years? All the negative shocks have come via very high flexibility from, let's say, workers and unions. And so your very useful wage tracker would probably start to sort of come down further this year, or is it sort of breaks the camel's back, and what we're showing in the surveys, firms start to shed labor, and does it imply different reactions potentially for you if the reaction in the short term of the labor market is different? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for this question. And you're right that in the very recent past, i.e., say mostly after our March meeting, we've seen some tightening of financial conditions, not least due to the appreciation of the euro. There is plenty of volatility concerning the exchange rate, and so far the impact over the, say, a bit longer term has been not so significant. But we have to be mindful of the development of financing conditions because we were seeing certain easing of financial conditions, but they have still remained tight, and now we are seeing some signs that might actually again tighten financing conditions. So this is certainly one factor we have to take a careful look as we approach our meeting of the 17th of April. And you're also right that these are, say, the two important elements. One is the tariff increases and their impact on growth in Europe, and the other one is how the financial conditions will evolve. As regards the labour market, we are seeing, or we have seen in the very recent period, some softening of the labour market. However, employment have still been quite robust, and as I said previously, unemployment is the record low. But yes, there is some softening in terms of vacancy rates, for instance. And when you combine that with a visible, not huge, but recognizable downward trend in wage inflation, then you can conclude that from the standpoint of price stability and us meeting the inflation target, the labor market is, or actually wage formation is evolving to the right direction. And at the same time, we have to keep in mind and continue to carefully analyze the development of the labor market, whether we are seeing, say, excessive softening, so that this could start increasing unemployment significantly. Yet we are not seeing that in data, but that's something that we need to look at. I think one element is worth adding, and that is that so far, largely the wage increases have been as a compensation of the loss of real income due to the increased price level. And it seems that this continues to be so, that we are not seeing excessively high wage increases concerning future expectations of inflation. I can say that the country I know best is a case in point, in the sense that the key trade unions, that's the industry union, together with the employers' technology industry, agreed on a, I dare to say, reasonable 3-year wage agreement 2 weeks ago, which has an overall impact of a bit less than 8% over 3 years, which is around 2.5–3% per year in the next 2 years, which, according to our assessment at the Bank of Finland, is fairly well in line in both in terms of both ensuring cost competitiveness of enterprises in Finland and supporting in a meaningful way the real incomes of the wage earners.
Thank you very much. Thank you indeed, Governor. I am now going to close our session. To keep with our footballing theme, in fact, we have gone well into injury time. But I close by thanking you, Governor Rehn, for the clarity of your presentation and indeed your responses to the many questions today. I heard one of our guests use the word somber, but I guess these are the realities we're facing as we enter what I might call this brave new world. But I thank you enormously. I thank all of our guests, both our Connect panelists and the wider audience, for joining us today at this MNI Connect event. I invite everybody now to please disconnect and end by saying, Ollie, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much,